Hello, welcome back to the second section of the first week of Economics 360. During the first clip we spoke about some of the general requirements for the course, in particular some of the items on the syllabus. Today we want to talk to the first two chapters that are on the assignment for this particular first week. So let me just take this opportunity one more time to stress how important it is, how essential it is that every single student buy the textbook and that you read all the material, and if you have to read it more than once, that will be fine. You've got to read it and read it again and read it again if you have to, and make sure that you understand all the details. So in today's session I'm going to try and deal with some of the highlights of these first two chapters. The first thing that is normally important is to try and paint a picture about what is the subject all about. And so I have taken the opportunity and decided to write some very few notes on the board in order to give you an idea what is it that we're going to talk about. So chapter 1 is essentially really nothing else but what is it that we mean when we speak about international economics and international trade. Why is it that it is treated as a separate subject and a very important separate area in economics? And then the third one is just to speak about some of the details, the current details about where we are when it comes to international trade, some very general remarks about that. So that once we have that particular background, in chapter 2, this is where the actual theory starts. So right from the beginning, therefore, let us ask the question, what is trade? Well, I hope that all of you will come to the conclusion, if you haven't thought about it by thinking about it for a few seconds, trade is really nothing else but exchange. It's nothing else but exchange of goods and services and commodities, merchandise, if you will, between two countries. So why should that be really any different than the fact that you have exchanged things with your next door neighbor, or certain two parties exchange goods and services within a particular country or within a particular region of a particular state? In principle, and that is the thing that we want to stress, is that the principle of exchange is essentially the same. What makes it different, what is it that warrants a special treatment for international trade, is that right now you're talking about different regions of the world, you're speaking about political boundaries, about different traditions, different customs, different governments, different regulations, and what is most important, different currencies. So all of a sudden, therefore, the problem of trade is that goods are no longer free to flow from one party to the other party because of all of these different restrictions that are going to be imposed on them by all of these different types of governments, which ultimately lead to that question of money. But what is essentially important is to note that in order to speak about trade, you really don't need to speak about money. The theories, as you'll find out, are really based on the idea of exchange only of commodities. The question of money we're going to deal with later on. You go ahead and you superimpose it. Now, what do we need money for, as probably all of you remember from your introductory economics? Money is needed only to facilitate trade. It makes it much more efficient. But we can do the same exchanges without money. However, it definitely wouldn't be as efficient. What would we do, by the way, if we have to do it without money? Then we will have to do nothing else but barter. And there are societies that have practiced barter until relatively recently, and there are certain economies that right now do get involved in barter. In particular, by the way, the societies, for example, if they don't have the liquidity to go ahead and purchase something or to pay for it, they very often arrange to just have a barter. I mean, to give you a very, very simple example that was very popular in the 70s and prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that Russia, as it is doing right now, it supplies Europe with lots of natural gas. Now, one way of getting paid was, for example, for Fiat of Italy to go ahead and build a car manufacturing facility in Russia. So Russia sends the gas and it gets paid in exchange with Ladas. Because the Lada, probably none of you is old enough to remember this, I'm sure actually that none of you is old enough to remember this, but Lada is essentially a Fiat, the Fiat 1500 of the 1970s, and so on and so forth. So really there's nothing novel about the idea of barter, but what we'd like to stress is that barter is inefficient, and that's why we created money. So later on we're going to talk about money, but not initially, because the theory really does not demand it. However, money is what creates really a problem in international trade, because as you will find out, maybe we should stress this right from the beginning, as we'll find out very soon actually, that trade is based on the assumption that it is going to be balanced. That's to say, you trade A for B. That is how you do barter. But if I buy and sell with money, then sometimes I will buy for more than what I have in order to exchange it with. And this is when you run into a deficit. So very many of the countries right now are running into deficits that are creating new problems. But that is really not the fault of the theory. The theory itself is one of the most tested theories in mainstream economics. People have been trying to find a fault with the theory per se for over 200 years. Nobody has been able to find a fault for it, in it, because it is very elegant, very mathematical, and very neat. What's wrong with it, as we'll find out later on, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't critique it, it deserves lots of criticism. Actually, I'm one of the people that is very highly critical of the way that we practice trade. But it's not only, it isn't the fault of the theory, it is the fault of how we go ahead and implement it, which is a completely different thing. Now, what is it that is so special about trade? Why is it that we're trying also to emphasize it besides all of these particular issues that we spoke to? Well, because the world is becoming more interdependent. As probably all of you know, at one point or another, actually even up until now, there is a big segment of the American public that would still like to lead an isolationist kind of, or to follow an isolationist kind of a policy in the United States. Because the United States is a very large country, it's blessed in a sense with natural resources, it doesn't have very many neighbors, it has one ocean on one side, another ocean on another side, and only two countries, one in the north and one in the south. So it doesn't have to do that much trade. And actually for a very long period of time, the United States, as a proportion of its GDP, did not have much trade. As we'll find out in a couple of minutes, even right now, the United States is not as heavily dependent on international trade as many of the other countries. But the trend ever since World War II, ever since this idea of trade that was developed by Smith and later on by Ricardo, when we started teaching it, we've got to practice it, because you can't teach something without practicing it. And so we started spreading the idea of having free international trade, and it has become, and it's actually up until now, the only policy that we have. There is no other policy for economic development besides that of international trade. We are totally dependent on international trade in order to have economic development. And you'll find out in very many cases it has worked, or at least in some cases. In the case of Japan, in the case of China, in the case of Korea. very few other countries have been able to develop without really reliance on trade. I mean, even Russia, that has not developed yet, but it is one of the countries that is just about to be considered a developed country. What is its main source of income? Russia doesn't produce that much on the international level. Most of its income is derived from trade because of its production of energy and its exports of energy. So Russia will not be able to prosper, to import many of the goods that it's importing right now to lead to a particular life standard, had it not been for the exports. So again, it needs therefore the international market. And the same thing is true obviously of the Chinese and of very many other countries. And we're finding out that it is true, it's becoming truer and truer all the time of the United States. This is what has led to the idea that probably all of us are familiar with, or at least the phrase that all of us are familiar with, that of globalization. Globalization was coined, that term, around 20 years ago, only in order to describe the fact that the international economy has become more and more integrated. What we mean by that, and we sometimes use the term, that it's a flat world. That's to say there aren't any longer as many barriers to prevent factors of production to move from one country to the other country. So people vote with their feet is another very common expression. That's to say people will leave from one country and they would go to another country in pursuit of certain conditions that they deem to be much better for their own welfare. One of these positions, obviously, or one of these conditions, not always the only thing, but definitely the issue of economic prosperity. So you'll find out, therefore, that international trade has grown by leaps and bounds. Maybe one of the best statistics to show this is that of exports as a proportion of the GDP. If you haven't thought about this before, because this might be the first course that you're taking in trade, just stop to reflect about it. If you have, let's assume, two particular societies, two particular economies, one of them exports only 10% of its GDP, while the other one exports, say, 70% of the GDP. Which one of these is going to be much more reliant on international trade? Obviously the one that exports 70% of its GDP, because then that particular country will not be able to attain very many of the things that it wants to do without exporting its goods. While the country that exports only, let's assume, 6 or 7% of its GDP, therefore that is a country that can more or less live on its own, doesn't want to get involved with the rest of the world. What you will find out right now is the world GDP is more or less around $75 trillion. What is the largest GDP, by the way, in the world? For those of you who, again, have not kept up with this, it's the US up until now. The US is right now probably around 17 or maybe just over 17 trillion. And China is very close, so very many people expect the Chinese GDP to surpass of the United States in the next 4 or 5 or 6 years. The figure that is normally used, and we don't know it does until really it happens, because nobody can predict what will happen in the future. But the figure that is used is, or the date that's used, is around 2020. So really, in the next 5 years or so, the Chinese GDP will become larger than that of the United States. But notice one thing, by the way, again, if you haven't reflected upon that, if the world GDP is 75 trillion, and I hope that we all know what's a trillion is 1,000 billion, and a billion is 1,000 million, so really a trillion is a million. So when you say that the world GDP is 75 trillion, it's really 75 million dollars. But notice that what we're saying is that, let's assume, just to use some round figures, give ourselves the right to play around with the data a little bit, and say the United States is 20 instead of 17, and say that China is going to become 20 in the next couple of years, and that the world GDP is going to be around 80. So then you're saying, really, in essence, that these two countries will represent 50% of the GDP in the world. And that's why you cannot discuss meaningfully anything in microeconomics or macroeconomics or international trade without paying attention to these two countries, to the United States and to China, and for a very long time to come. Things will change as time goes on. Now, if you want to get even a bigger and a better picture of what are the major forces, then all what you have to do is to add in the EU and add in Japan. Once you add in the EU and Japan, you'll find out that GDP-wise, these will probably represent around the 70% of the GDP of the world, if not even more so. I haven't figured it out totally, but you see the EU is larger than the United States GDP-wise if you put them all together. So that will be probably another 25 billion. So we're already talking about 65 trillion. And then you throw in, close to probably 8 trillion for the Japanese, and all of a sudden you might be talking about 70 trillion out of the 80 trillion in the world that belong to only these four groups. And the same thing is true in exports. Now, the measure of how widely spread is international trade, as I said, is that proportionality. Now, the most recent figures will suggest that the world exports right now are 22 trillion, or around 22 trillion. 22 out of 75, which is really almost exactly 30%. Now, these are not precise figures, by the way, and it depends where the figures, who is it that's compiling the figures. The CIA, the World Bank, the IMF, each of them winds up with a slightly different figure. Not a very major variation, but they do wind up with a variation. Some of them will say 74, another one will say 75, another one might say 73, or whatever. But more or less, therefore, what you're saying is that the exports in the world represent around 30% of the GDP, of the world GDP. But as you well know, by the way, this is a very simple thing when you talk about the world. All the exports have got to be equal to all the imports, because whoever exports something is going to be imported by another one. So if you want to be precise, you'll find out that the world imports, therefore, are going to be exactly the same as the world exports. So there are some people that speak of trade as a percentage of the GDP by combining both exports and imports. So if you combine exports and imports together, what do you find out then? You'll find out that around 60% of the world GDP is due to trade. And that is precisely why is it that it is so important. It affects the life of everyone. I mean, what would be certain other figures that are important just to stress what is it that goes on in the United States, to try and lend this something that you can relate to. In the US, we are not at 30%. Our exports represent only 14% of our GDP. In China, they represent around 26% of their GDP. So notice, therefore, that the Chinese economy is much more dependent on international trade than that of the United States. And things become even a little bit more concentrated. The dependence on trade can grow substantially more. If you look, for example, at Germany, another one of the big countries, because really when you speak about the EU is essentially, I know many people will object to that, especially if you come of a European background, but really the EU is Germany for all practical purposes. I mean, even France is becoming weaker and weaker, and Germany is growing stronger and stronger in relative terms. So in Germany, both the exports and the imports, each of them is above 52 to 55% of the GDP. And so you'll find out, therefore, that for Germany, international trade is much more important than it is for a country such as that of the United States. And that's why they pay that much closer attention to the geopolitical problems of the world than we tend to do. So although trade is very essential for the United States, we are the number 2 exporter in the world, and we are the number 1 importer in the world. China is exactly the reverse. It is the number 1 exporter and the number 2 importer. The third country in both exports and imports is Germany. The fourth country in exports and imports is Japan. So notice one more time, this sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you go ahead and add these countries and throw in some of the other members of the EU, you will find out that very easily 1/2 of the exports and 1/2 of the imports belong to the developed countries. So as important as trade is, and although it's a theory that we try to stress for economic development, we find out that the people who practice it the most are those that are already developed. So most of the trade is between developed countries. And most of the trade is in commodities. Not that there aren't services. We're not going to talk about the distinction between commodities and services right now. We'll talk about that later on, towards the end of the semester. But as you probably well know, most of you, let's assume, give an example. Let's assume some of you in this classroom are, let's say, either Asian students or African students or European students. And you're in the United States on a student visa only in order to study. What do you think is your activity counted as when it comes to the international trade? Have you influenced trade? And the answer is, of course you have. Because actually all what you're doing is really part and parcel of international trade. When you come to PACE, for example, to seek education, it's as if PACE has exported its services to that particular country. And therefore, it will count as if it's an export of the United States. But in this case, it's not a commodity, it is going to be a service. The same thing is true, of medical services, of financial services, and very many other services. But services are yet not as important as commodities. So manufactured goods still represent not quite 70%, but they represent very close to 70% of all international trade. And then you'll have to definitely add in the agricultural goods and definitely services and what have you in order to account for the other 30%. So trade has become very important and has grown. If you look, for example, at this figure, this is for last year, for 2013. If you are to go back only to the 1990s, you'll find out that the exports, instead of being 30%, they were only around 18%. So only in 20 years, the exports in the world have risen from being 18% to being over 30%. Taking into consideration the fact that in 2008 we dropped substantially. So had it not been for the Great Recession of 2008, then our dependence on trade might have been even larger than what it is right now. But the other thing to keep in mind, therefore, is that the United States is not as dependent as other countries, although it is very important these days, and you cannot deny the importance of trade, because actually very many people will say that some of the most important jobs that we have, some of our highest paying jobs that we have, are those that are really related to trade. Again, I know that we have a problem with time, so I don't want to spend that much time on these details, but let me just give you a very simple example. What do you think is one of our major exports? Now, if you've thought about it, I wonder how many of you would have said, for example, Boeing. Commercial aircraft. Wherever you go in the world, you have only, for all practical purposes, you have only a choice between two companies. So all of these thousands of airplanes flying all over the world are either manufactured by Airbus or are manufactured by the United States. So the world market is extremely important, therefore, for the United States in this particular case, because we want to be able to export these airplanes. And these airplanes are the ones that are, these airplane manufacturers are the ones that are hiring very highly skilled people and are paying very high wages. And the same thing is true of very many other goods and services. So definitely, that is very crucial. Actually, one can probably even point to the fact that very often American presidents make trips overseas indirectly to wind up really in acting as salespeople for Boeing and certain other companies in the United States. Because in general, once you sell Boeing, you sell an airplane without its engines. But in most of the cases also, what kind of an engine do you wind up with? They wind up with a GE engine. And again, these are some of the most highly sophisticated commodities or manufactured goods all over the world. So as you can see, we are very highly dependent on this, but we are not as dependent as others. Now, the other thing that's probably important to note is Japan. Japan, very many people think that it's nothing else but a trading nation. Well, it is, but it's not more highly dependent than the United States. Japan exports around 12% of its GDP, even a little bit less than the United States. It is China and Europe that are much more dependent on trade. You have, by the way, certain countries that have only 6% of their GDP that is exported. I mean, the one that comes to mind, obviously, is Afghanistan. But Afghanistan makes up for it by importing quite a lot because it doesn't produce anything. So very many of the many countries in the world might have a very low proportion of exports to their GDP, but they will compensate for that by having a very high proportion of imports to their GDP. And that's where you run into the problem, by the way, of how is it that you're going to pay for it. Because then you'll be exporting things that are not as valuable as the things that you are importing, and that's when you run into a deficit. So the other problem, before we leave this, that we've got to become extremely cognizant of in the United States, is that for the macroeconomy, for the sake of your welfare and mine, for the sake of the domestic economy, the purchasing power of the dollar, the rate of inflation, and so on and so forth, we must and we have to pay attention to the problem of international trade. Because our deficit, we have a problem on the macro level that we call it, by the way, the dual deficit problem. Everybody, whenever you read the newspaper, speaks only about the deficit as a result of the federal budget. That is important, no doubt, but that's not the only deficit that we have. Our other major deficit, that again doesn't look as if it has a solution, at least not in the foreseeable future, is that of our trade deficits. That's to say, the United States has been consistently importing more than it's exporting for over 40 years. Ever since the early 70s, we haven't had a single surplus, probably, in our balance of trade. So every single year, we export much less than we import. Now, by how much do you think? Right now, it's running at around $400 billion, but it has been as high as $500 billion. Again, stop to reflect on this. There are 365 days in a year. You've got to find over $400 or $500 billion every year just to pay for the additional imports, which is more than $1 billion a day. So every single day when you wake up, the United States has to find more than $1.25 billion to $1.5 billion in order to pay, not for its export, for the net imports over the exports. And that is obviously a huge problem. Up until now, we've been able to do it. The problem is what will happen if for one reason or another, I mean, how do you do it? You do it, by the way, by borrowing money, by having a capital inflow into your country. So far it hasn't been really a problem because most of the rest of the world is willing to invest in the United States, and so they send us their money. But what if they're not going to do that? So there is going to be a problem, or there might be a problem eventually as a result of this balance of trade, and it definitely affects the value of the dollar, the rate of exchange of the dollar. Therefore your purchasing power, therefore your economic welfare. So there is no doubt that the domestic economy, the macro economy, is very much influenced by trade, especially in the world in which we live right now. If we are right now to move ahead and say a few words about Chapter 2, which is really the theory. Again, I'm going to try to be a little bit brief in this, but highlight one of the most important things about the theory. Let me start by just mentioning very quickly a very rough historical development. You could say initially that the world was ruled by and dominated by empires. At the end of the rule of empires, more or less, let's assume as the 1500 to the 1800, from the 16th century to the 19th century, that's when the economic policy that was dominant was that of mercantilism. So notice that up until now we haven't spoken about international trade. We've been talking about trade right now for the past, 15, 20 minutes or whatever it is, and many people think that it has always been the case. No, it hasn't. International trade became dominant only as a result of the neoclassical thought of Adam Smith, and later on Ricardo and others. But when was the Wealth of Nations published? Only 1776. So it was less than 250 years ago that the kernel of the idea of free international trade was presented. If you go ahead and look at the chapters later on that are going to deal with the history, you'll find out that the world has never really practiced free international trade for any length of time. We've practiced it for a very, very short period of time. But what is important is that after World War II, we have knocked down the barriers quite a lot. And so we are practicing right now more free trade than we did before. We are not already at that optimum whereby we have free trade, and probably we never will. Because what is the optimum of free trade is not to have any barriers whatsoever. But we know that there are barriers. I mean, even right now, as low as the barriers are, most of the barriers, by the way, are low only for manufactured goods. They're not that low yet for agricultural goods. They're not that low yet for certain services and so on and so forth. So it's the aim is to arrive at free trade. Why is it that Smith wanted to speak about trade? It's simply because of what we had spoken about earlier. That's to say to him, and he gives that example whereby he says that in a particular village, for example, or town, you have somebody who is a baker, another one is a cobbler, a third one is a candle maker, a fourth one is a butcher, and so on and so forth. Each one specializes in the production of one commodity. Why? Because division of labor will make them more productive. So if each of them is going to specialize in the production of one commodity, then they'll be able to produce more, and then they will exchange. So society as a whole, therefore, will become better off, because given the same resources, it would be able to produce more. But this was a very novel idea, the idea of free international trade. Because the mercantilists, let's say the prior 300 years prior to Smith, we had nothing else but monarchs that are whose only objective is to create strong armies and large navies because they want power. But how are you going to be able to have a large army and a strong army and a large navy? To make a long story short, you need lots of money. What was the form of money that was used at the time? There were no checks like we have right now, very little, if any, paper currency. It was nothing else but bullion. It was gold and silver. Well, what happens if you're in a country that doesn't have any mines? Then you're out of luck. You don't have any, either gold or silver. And very few countries have mines of gold and silver. So what do you do then? Well, there is a way whereby you can earn gold and silver. How do you do that? Again, through trade. But how would you earn the gold and silver through trade? There's only one way. And only one mechanism, absolutely nothing else. You've got to export more than you import. And then, therefore, you would have earned more money, i.e. more gold and silver, more bullion. Okay, so you are that particular monarch who wants to build up a navy and an army, and you want to expand. So you want to have more exports rather than imports. What do? You've got to regulate. You can't allow things to be free, because you operate under the assumption that if you try to restrict the imports and you try to encourage the exports, you're going to wind up with a surplus. But this suffers of a major, major flaw, doesn't it? Because let's assume that the world is divided only into two countries. Country A wants to have a surplus, and country B wants to have a surplus. Can they both have a surplus? No. Because the surplus of one is going to be the deficit of the other. So therefore, this idea of mercantilism, and it was dominant for over 300 years. Actually, there are some people right now that still really believe in it. So it's not totally dead in a sense. Those that want to build walls around the United States. They're really isolationists for all practical purposes. So what do they want to do? These monarchs, therefore. That is what has led, as you can see, to colonialism. Because what's the easiest way, or at least what appeared to them a very easy way, of expanding the markets for your exports? You try and have certain captive markets. What's the easiest way to have a captive market? You go ahead and you colonize a country. Therefore, all that country that you're going to colonize is going to have to import things from you. Therefore, your exports are going to increase. And you place strong restrictions on all the imports. You even go ahead and specify what kind of boats, where the and ships are going to be registered that are going to carry the merchandise. So prior to Smith, it was a total regulation, exactly the opposite. 180 degrees, the opposite of free trade. And it is the one that has led to colonialization. Whenever I mention this, by the way, I just always feel like throwing in also the line that the United States, would it, do you think, have revolted against Great Britain had it not been for the mercantilistic policies of King George? And the answer is probably not. Nobody can predict what is it that would have happened, but one of the single most important reasons for the American uprising was really the mercantilistic policies, because they wanted to use the American market to go ahead and dump British goods, and they wanted to restrict American exports. And people had enough, and then they revolted, and they said that you can't have taxation but representation, and so on and so forth. So it has played a very major role in the spread of colonialism all over the world, and then in the revolutions against colonialism all over the world. So as you can see, therefore, international trade is extremely important in understanding historical developments. Therefore, right now we are at that stage whereby we believe very sincerely that the optimal condition, the best thing for anyone in the world, is to have free trade. Smith obviously was the first person to speak about modern economics, so his ideas were not as sophisticated as those that will come after him. After Smith, actually most of the ideas about trade, up until now, it hasn't changed, are essentially Ricardo's. They are Ricardian ideas. Then there were some questions that were raised also by Ricardo, but he was not able to answer them. They were answered by Heckscher-Ohlin, but without really adding much to Ricardo. They just added a simple twist to it. So it's really mercantilism, Smith, Ricardo, Heckscher-Ohlin, and Heckscher-Ohlin is also known as the factor endowment. And again, we're going to talk about these things later on. But for our purposes, we're going to stop only at Smith today. So what is the basic idea of Smith? The essential thing that we're going to have to stress, both for today and for next week, is that Smith and Ricardo, to understand their model, there are certain commonalities. The single most important idea without which their theory wouldn't make sense is that to them, the question of value is what is referred to as LTV, labor theory of value. So the value of an particular item is determined by the labor that is embedded in that particular item. Again, to use certain examples from Smith, he speaks about how is it that if it takes 10 hours to hunt a deer and it takes 5 hours to hunt a beaver, how would you exchange them? You will exchange them for 2 beavers for 1 deer. Why? Because each beaver has only 5 hours, while each deer has 10 hours. Therefore, every deer is equal to 2 beavers. So this idea of the labor theory of value is not very popular these days. But there are certain economists that have been doing experiments, and the claim is that even the price theory that we know right now, in most cases the prices are more or less, not exactly obviously, but more or less a reflection of the amount of labor that is embedded in each particular item. So the item that requires more labor is the item that tends to be more expensive than the one that doesn't require as much labor, and so on and so forth. So the idea, although we don't apply it totally these days, is very essential for an understanding of the dynamics of the theory. So Smith was able to answer or to build a model around the question of what has become known as an absolute advantage. So 2 countries will trade and both of them will benefit. It's no longer a zero-sum game, provided that they use labor theory of value and provided that they specialize 100%. But what is implicit in this is that each country must have an advantage in the production of one good over the other country. So you do one thing better than I do, and I do one thing better than you do, therefore I specialize in one item, you specialize in another item, and we go ahead and exchange them. And that way both of us will be better off. Let me run through a very simple example. And we're going to do the same thing for Ricardo next week, but we'll complicate it a little bit more. But you've got to follow this very closely, and that's the reason really that I decided to put it up on the board. Let's assume that we have 2 countries, Portugal and England. And they're producing only 2 goods, wine and cloth. And we use over here the cost in labor hours. So let's assume that the units are, 1 gallon of wine and 1 yard of cloth. So in Portugal, to produce 1 gallon of wine, it takes 2 labor hours. So this is in hours. In England, to produce the 1 gallon of wine, it takes 8 labor hours. While on the other hand, when it comes to cloth, you'll find out that the Portuguese can produce 1 yard of cloth in 10 labor hours, while the Brits can produce it in 1 labor hour. So let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that we don't have any trade whatsoever. None. This is what's known, by the way, as an autarky. That's to say, every single country is going to be totally self-sufficient, is not going to have any relations with the rest of the world in any way, form, or fashion. So in an autarky, what is going to be the cost of this basket of producing 2 wines and 2 cloths? Let's say we're going to assume that each country is going to produce 1 wine and 1 cloth. Well, all what we have to do, as you can see, is add up the number of hours. So you'll find out that the production of 2 wines and 2 cloths with no trade is going to be 21 hours. So how can we show right now that trade is going to be beneficial? Well, which is the country that's going to be able to specialize, that has the greatest advantage in the production of cloth? Obviously, it's England. Which is the country that's going to have an advantage in the production of wine? It's going to be Portugal. So right now, the Portuguese will produce 2 wines, and the British will produce 2 cloth. Now, in order to be able to compare apples to apples, let's find out what's going to be the cost of the same identical basket, i.e. we want only 2 wines and 2 cloth. So the 2 wines in Portugal is what? 4 hours. The 2 cloth in England is 2 hours. So what is the sum? The sum is 6 hours. So notice what we've said, and this is the miracle of international trade. The same basket, once we go ahead and specialize, can be produced in 6 hours instead of 21 hours. So how much are the gains? The gains are 15 hours. Now, there are 15 hours that the 2 countries can split amongst each other. 14-1, 7-8, 7.5, 7.5, or whatever. We don't know how to split them yet. And that, by the way, is what has raised quite a lot of criticism of the theories of international trade. Because it goes without saying, if one country is going to get all the 15, then the other country isn't going to benefit, and therefore it will say, hey, why am I doing this? Or if one country is going to get, for example, 14, and the other country is going to get 1 only, they'll say, what, I'm being abused, because I'm not getting my fair share. But the idea is that they are going to get 15. How they're going to split it is a different issue. We'll talk about that later on. So they can use this 15, by the way, either to produce more, or to just go ahead and, hug trees, or sing songs, or write books, or dance, or whatever. Whatever they think is going to improve their life. So international trade in this particular case has created a surplus that they can use in order to satisfy some other needs that they might have. And this will always be true if you have 2 countries that enjoy absolute advantage. What he was not able to answer, though, Smith, and that's why all the credit normally is given to Ricardo, and I'll leave it only at that right now, we'll talk about it next week, is that what will happen, do you think, if one country, either Portugal or England, is going to have an advantage in the production of both? Does that mean that there shouldn't be any trade? Most people will say that no, there shouldn't be any trade, therefore. I mean, even Smith probably would have said that. But we're going to show later on, once we speak about Ricardo, he was able to show that even when one country has an advantage in the production of both, yet they should specialize and they can trade and both of them will benefit. So having said that, I will leave you with this. Please let me stress one more time, you've got to read the chapters, take down notes, make sure that everything is clear, because we're going to keep moving on, and so next week we'll have to have another 2 chapters plus an article. You've got to read for next week, not for this week, the article about mercantilism. Okay? Yeah, bye-bye.